Thank you to the Fallbrook Climate Action Team Zoom talk. We've been doing this for how many? 7, 8, 9 years now? Joy, Tom?
8?
8 years. 8 years. And we are a group, if you're not familiar with us, of ordinary citizens who are concerned about climate change and the effect it's going to have on our living world. And we have, for those who can't make it and have the opportunity to ask questions of our speaker, we are now offering quite a few of our recorded sessions that are available through our website. Anything else I should mention off the top of my head? Joy, Tom? No, all right.
I can mention that next month we're going to have as our speaker R.L. Miller, who has spoken to us before in person. She's head of a group called Climate Hawks Vote, and she'll be talking about the grid and the kind of plans we need to make in our state to increase our capacity on the grid, and what direction we need to go on that because of our increased electricity usage. And that'll be on a Monday for a change rather than a Tuesday because of Halloween. We're going to do it on Halloween Eve next month.
Okay. Well, I think I'll just get right to it now, and I'm going to introduce, as it is my pleasure to do, Orion McCarthy, who is a scientist and PhD candidate at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography. And even before he was at Scripps, he had, and even before he gotten his BS in ecology and evolution, he had some significant experiences. He interned at the International Pacific Halibut Commission, which I thought was pretty interesting. But more interesting for him, he spent a semester at the University of Australia, at James Cook University of Australia, where he first dove on coral reefs. And I think that's probably where his interest in coral reef science was born. Subsequent to his undergraduate degree, he worked for several years in Washington, D.C. for the World Wildlife Fund. And he also worked with the Meridian Institute. And from those experiences, he got a taste of the world of ocean policy. And these combined experiences showed him that it was possible to have a career on the interface of science and policy, and to also have a career of applied research that makes a real difference in the world. So now that he is at Scripps, he is working with a cadre of scientists who are using coral reef science to better understand reef dynamics, and who are applying that knowledge to inform coral reef conservation efforts. And not to dry out even in his off time, I want to point out that Orion is also a volunteer diver at the Birch Aquarium. So jealousy here. So I'm going to give it to you now, Orion, so you can correct anything I got wrong and say what you have to tell us tonight.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Cynthia. It's great to be here with all of you virtually, and I'm excited to talk about my research and just more broadly the research that the lab that I'm part of at Scripps does, because it all relates sort of to marine ecosystems and climate change, but various different ecosystems. My focus is on coral reefs in particular, but we also do a lot of work on local ecosystems such as kelp forests. And I know that since you all are in Southern California, just want to also make sure to talk about some local ecosystems that you all may have interacted with before, in addition to coral reefs. So, yeah, go ahead.
Interrupt you briefly because I forgot to tell people that they can ask questions. Probably they will be at the end, and you can type them into our chat box. But if you have something that's burning right now, go ahead and put up your green hand, and we will attempt to get to it before then. So thank you. Give it back to you now.
That's a good reminder. So let me share my screen. Is everyone seeing a picture of me diving?
Yeah, yes.
Awesome. Cool. So yeah, so my name is Orion McCarthy. I am now a just starting my 6th year as a PhD student at Scripps Institution of Oceanography down in La Jolla. I'm originally from the East Coast of the US, from Washington, D.C. And as Cynthia mentioned in her introduction, I've had a variety of different conservation or marine science experiences before coming to Scripps, did some fisheries science work, did some ocean policy work, was able to study abroad in Australia, where I got to sort of see coral reefs firsthand. And all of that sort of drew me to Scripps to pursue conservation and marine ecology science. And that's really part of the reason why I chose to apply to work with Dr. Jennifer Smith, who runs the Smith Lab at Scripps. It's within the Center for Marine Biodiversity and Conservation, or CMBC, at Scripps. And the Smith Lab, as I mentioned in the intro, is focused across different ecosystems, both coral reefs in the tropics, but also local ecosystems here in California. And the sort of the common thread there is solutions-based science that is trying to address human impacts, whether that's climate change or other direct human impacts. And I'll talk a little bit about that throughout the talk. But yeah, that sort of solutions-focused science is the cross-cutting theme there. And some just we work on a variety of topics. 4 projects that I wanted to talk about today, which all relate to climate in some way, shape, or form, are sort of 3 local projects, and then also some of the work that I've been doing with coral reefs. But you can see my PI, Dr. Jen Smith, in the top left, with a type of red algae that we're exploring some biotech solutions with to help address carbon emissions. And then there's also one of my fellow graduate students, Mohammed Sederat, is diving here in the kelp forest. He's been focusing his PhD on tracking change in the local kelp forest canopy and the recovery dynamics of kelp over time. Down in the bottom left, we have this really cool project called Tides, which is basically a collaboration between Scripps and tribal communities along the coast to try to document how the intertidal zone is changing as sea levels rise. And then there's me diving in Maui, where I do the bulk of my research, and I'll talk about that for the latter half of the talk. But yeah, as Cynthia mentioned, I have built-in time at the end for questions, and look forward to answering those. If you have a burning question, you can also raise your hand, and I'll try to address it as I go. But yeah, so this first project that I wanted to talk about relates, surprisingly enough, to livestock, even though it is a marine science project. Basically, I guess I haven't provided a lot of background about climate, because I assume if you guys are all part of this group that you're aware of a lot of sort of the urgency of us addressing climate change. The greenhouse gases are what are driving the warming of the planet. Most of those gases are produced either by people or processes related to people. And one of those processes related to people is livestock, particularly cattle that are producing methane as sort of a byproduct of existing. And we have an incredible number of cattle on this planet that we are either raising for beef or for dairy. And so the methane they produce is a potent greenhouse gas that, while it has a shorter lifespan in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide, it has much more of a warming punch. And so the way that actually loops in here is that there's this red seaweed that grows off our coast here, but also throughout shallow ecosystems worldwide, called Asparagopsis taxiformis. And this picture, you can kind of guess why it got that name. It sort of looks like the head of asparagus, that sort of fluffy triangular shape. It's this really beautiful red seaweed that creates a compound called bromoform. And when that bromoform is ingested by cattle, it actually causes them to reduce their methane production and output by upwards of 90%. And so the idea is, if we can cultivate this seaweed at a commercial scale and incorporate it into a cow's diet, it only needs to be about 1% or less of the cow's diet, that you could drastically reduce methane production from the livestock industry. And that could have a real sort of short-term impact on climate change because methane has such a short lifetime in the atmosphere. So our lab has been doing a lot of work focused on how to cultivate this seaweed because it has a complicated life cycle. A lot of seaweeds have a pretty complicated 3-part life cycle. And there's like a haplotype phase and a sporophyte phase with different amounts of chromosomes. And it's basically trying to create settings in the lab where you can rear this seaweed at a commercial cultivation scale. It's not as easy to grow as any of our land-based crops. So that's what a lot of the lab's research lately relating to this seaweed has been focused on, trying to map geographically where different strains can be found and if certain strains are better at producing this compound that causes cows to produce less methane, trying to find out what nutrient combinations cause the seaweed to grow the best. And so they start in these little flasks in the lab and then eventually get sort of migrated to these big sun tubes that we have outside. And this project is in collaboration with Blue Ocean Barns, which is an aquaculture operation that's based in San Diego, and then also with UC Davis, which is doing all sort of the livestock end of the research. But that is a very emerging and potentially very impactful area of research in our lab that, while less ecosystem focused, is very climate focused in trying to reduce greenhouse gases. The other sort of local work that our lab's doing I mentioned was with kelp forests. So on the left, you can see a vibrant, healthy kelp forest, and they create all sorts of habitat for fish. And I'm privileged to get to dive in a fake kelp forest when I volunteer at Birch Aquarium. It's one of my favorite dives because the kelp forest is beautiful and there's all the fish there and they're all interested in getting fed and it's just very fun. But out just off our coast in La Jolla, we also have those very same kelp forests, or at least we did up until recently. Now a lot of the area looks like what you see on the right with less kelp biomass. And in some parts of California, that loss of kelp is caused by the removal of sea otters, which leads to a spike in sea urchins, and sea urchins eat the kelp and can lead to these what are called urchin barrens. But in addition to sort of that aspect of the ecosystem being out of balance and causing a decline in kelp, there's also sort of a relationship between kelp and ocean temperature. And the temperature has been fluctuating but steadily increasing over the last several decades due to human-caused climate change. And we've had some record warm water here in Southern California in the last few years. In particular, we had an El Nino in 2015 and then also record warm summer temperatures in 2018. And so here's just some visuals of El Nino in addition to human-caused climate change, slowly increasing ocean temperatures over decades. We have these fluctuations called El Nino that can cause huge shifts in global climate patterns based on changes in ocean currents. And those are acutely felt in Southern California, both because it changes precipitation patterns, which we saw this last year with all the rain we got, and sort of changing our long-term drought scenario that we'd been in. But it also impacts ocean currents. In particular, it can shut down upwelling off the coast of California that brings cool, nutrient-rich ocean water up from the deep, and that keeps the surface ocean along our beaches pretty cool. It can shut that down and lead to this sort of persistent layer of warm water that forms near the coast. And that can have devastating impacts on the kelp. Here is a map of from this organization called Kelp Watch. And basically this here is La Jolla jutting out into the Pacific Ocean. You can see Mount Soledad here. And then this pixelated area is a map of the La Jolla kelp canopy. And this is back in 2013. And so this is the spatial footprint of the kelp detected from satellite images. Basically, when the kelp grows tall enough, it spreads out at the surface and can be detected by Landsat satellite imagery. But this is the area of the kelp canopy during that El Nino in 2015. And you can see that drastic decline in area that's covered in just a few years. But one hopeful sort of, I guess, caveat to this type of data that has some reason for hope that we actually just got presented today by the PhD student who's working on this is that even though the canopy is gone, that doesn't mean all the kelp is gone. He was doing a different survey technique in 2018 when there was that record warm water temperature I mentioned, where instead of using satellite imagery, he was using a fish sounder and a boat and doing transects back and forth in this same area, and found that there still was kelp. It just wasn't making it all the way to the surface because the water was so warm in a sort of band of maybe 10 feet or so towards the surface that the kelp was basically melting or disintegrating in that surface area, but the kelp below that, where it was cooler, was still alive. So just some interesting science about how using different methods, detecting different amounts of kelp, whether it's persisting or not. And they're using that science and some of his other research in his PhD to both map the current extent of kelp forests in La Jolla, but also to look into solutions for restoration of kelp, particularly after heat waves or El Nino events that might wipe out local kelp forests. If they can be reseeded, then sort of trying to set up an experiment to figure out what ways of restoring kelp are the most effective, what spatial footprints, what methods. One method is called green gravel, where you actually attach kelp spores to essentially gravel, and then you can disperse that into a kelp forest, and that can be a quicker and easier way than having to go and manually physically plant different kelp fronds. So it's also just like the Asparagopsis project I mentioned, this is an active area of research, both mapping how things are changing in our ecosystems offshore here, but also very solutions focused in trying to test different restoration approaches and to see what is the most viable. And so that brings me to the third project I wanted to talk about today, which is TIDES, which stands for Tribal Intertidal Digital Ecological Surveys. And these surveys of the intertidal, they take place in Southern California here. We have a site right off the coast of Scripps. If you've ever been to the beach in La Jolla, there's the tide pools that are just north of Scripps Pier. We have a site there that's actually shown here in this video. And then we also have 3 sites down by Cabrillo National Monument, which I'll show you some of those on the next slide. But basically this video was generated by basically taking overlapping images, pictures of the intertidal, and then stitching them together into a 3D model. And I'll talk about that technology more when I move on to the coral reef section, because that's also how we do a lot of our coral-based research in the lab. But we also apply that technology here locally to map the intertidal and to see how that ecosystem changes over time. And so here's 3 of those sites from Cabrillo National Monument, spanning from, on the left is sort of the lower intertidal that is often submerged, all the way up to the upper intertidal on the right, where it's more rocky and fewer organisms living there. And so this approach is really cool because it allows us to study the ecosystem in various ways. We can make a height map or a depth map and study how organisms ranges in the intertidal correspond to different depths. And we also can look at what organisms are living at different parts of the intertidal and quantify the amount of habitat covered by, say, seagrass or mussels. And it allows us to do in-depth studies of an area that in reality is very dynamic and changing with the tide going in and out. And that can make actual field work challenging. So having access to a 3D model and all the raw imagery associated with it it allows for uninterrupted access to this site. And we can also see how the ecosystem changes over time. And so one project they're working on is to map the range of seagrass and other species in these models, and then to look at the depth range that those species need, and then to use models to project with sea level rise how that will impact the available habitat for these organisms that rely on the intertidal for their habitat. And so again, having that depth information and the ability to create a map of where these species are living is really important to be able to answer those types of research questions. And I guess the one aspect that I glossed over that's important about this project too is that it's done in collaboration with indigenous tribes. So the sites that are monitored outside of sort of our local San Diego area are done in collaboration with various tribes. There's some projects, I believe, up in the Pacific Northwest that are building capacity for the tribes to use these cameras and software to create these 2D models, to basically document a lot of the indigenous knowledge that they have, to use that in conjunction with this technology to document sea level rise and the way that that's impacting their local ecosystems. So it's very much, this technology approach is tied in with an ongoing basically tribal management of their resources. And so that's been a really cool project to be able to help out with, because it is, at least the Scripps Coastal Reserve model that we collect data for is just a short walk away from our offices. So it's been cool to get out in the intertidal on a spring tide, and to, when the water's all the way out, and to get the cameras out there real quick before the tide comes back in, and to see how after a storm there might be a bunch of sand that's washed in or been eroded away, and to see on a seasonal time scale and over multiple years how that ecosystem is changing. But my heart, even though all this temperate stuff close to home is fun, my heart lies with the coral reef research. And as Cynthia mentioned, fell in love with that from an academic point of view when I studied abroad, but even from a younger age, going to aquariums and watching nature documentaries, and really fell in love with conservation in general. But when I got a chance to go to grad school, I was like, well, if I could study anything, I'd like to focus on coral reefs. And part of the reason that reefs are important to me and to many people around the world is the amount of biodiversity they support. There's a variety of estimates, but the one that I see most often is that about 1 in 4 marine species spend at least some portion of their life cycle on a coral reef. And so in that way, they're like the cities of the ocean. They occupy a very small spatial footprint, basically all the area shown in red, because they need shallow tropical water, but they host such a huge diversity of marine life. And so they're really these hotspots of biodiversity. And because of that, they also are really important for people around the world. Because they support all this biodiversity, so there's lots of fisheries that are either directly reef fisheries or indirectly through the marine food web related to coral reefs that feed hundreds of millions of people around the world. Then from another economic angle, people like me who went to Australia to study abroad, or going anywhere for coral reef related tourism, are helping to support those local economies by going out to visit the reef. And then the reef itself is a living, growing structure that helps to protect coastal human communities from storm surge or big waves, because it is basically dampening the effect of those waves and keeping all that energy from reaching shore. So these are just some reasons why coral reefs are important for people, in addition to supporting all of that biodiversity. But they are, as anyone who's been focused on climate and reading the news and understanding that corals and climate are linked might have heard, there are a lot of threats that coral reefs are facing. And I don't want it to be a doom and gloom talk. I promise there'll be positive aspects I talk about coral conservation and ways that we can make a difference. But I do want to talk about all these different ways that corals are being impacted. You have overfishing, which removes key components of the ecosystem that help to keep corals and algae in check. There's pollution, runoff, and coastal development that are all sort of intertied with each other that can impact any nearshore ecosystem, whether it's a coral reef or a kelp forest. And tourism in many ways is good for reefs by allowing protection for them or income to support their conservation. But unsustainable tourism can further damage reefs if tourists don't know how they're supposed to interact with corals, or if there's an unsustainable number of tourists. And then sort of these other factors can also lead to natural processes such as disease or predation getting out of whack. So there's things like crown of thorns starfish, which are shown in this picture right here, that are naturally occurring coral predators that if there's issues with nutrient, effluent, and other factors like removal of their predators, these starfish can basically form huge densities and eat a large part of the living coral reef, which can be really bad. And then there's these other sort of really big scale processes that threaten coral reefs and are linked to climate change. You have like increasing frequency and severity of tropical storms, sea level rise that can threaten to basically drown coral reefs, ocean acidification, where the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and by extension the ocean can make it harder for corals to grow their calcium carbonate skeletons. And then you can have marine heat waves that lead to coral bleaching. And because that's the one we often hear about in the news. So I want to take a second to talk about that a little bit and the science behind it. Corals themselves are animals, and they exist and grow because they have these tiny microscopic algae called zooxanthellae that live inside their tissue. And so this is basically a symbiotic relationship between the corals and the algae. The corals get nutrition from the photosynthesis of the algae making the sugars from the sun, and the algae get a safe home inside the coral. But if the coral is under stress, say from the water being too warm, this partnership breaks down, sort of like when our body is having a fever. It doesn't have to be that much warmer than what we're used to, but sort of that stress response causes a bunch of stuff to start going out of whack. And for corals, that's basically they kick their symbiont friends out. And what happens is they've lost their source of food because they're using the photosynthesis of the algae as a food source. But they also turn white because corals are basically, they're animals, as I said before. They're closely related to jellyfish. And so they're just a thin layer of jelly-like tissue that lives around these hard white skeletons. And a healthy coral gets a lot of its color from those algae that live inside of it. But when the coral doesn't have that algae anymore, basically you're seeing through the coral's tissue to the white skeleton underneath. And so when you see a white bleached coral, it's actually still alive. It just doesn't have a source of food. And so over time, if conditions persist and it doesn't have a source of food for long enough, the coral animal will die. And then the skeleton that's left behind gets sort of colonized by this gross scuzzy algae, not the same photosynthetic beneficial algae, but like the type of scuzz that you might have inside an aquarium that you didn't clean. And so just as an example of what that might look like, here in the big picture, you can see a reef with lots of bleaching corals, and just the progression here from a healthy coral on the right downwards to more and more bleached, and then eventually the bleached colony dying and being covered by this gross scuzzy turf algae. And so the issue that corals are facing with this increased temperature in the ocean is the increased frequency of bleaching events. This map here is basically showing the amount of heat stress at various places in the ocean from June 2014 to May 2017. And that was a global coral bleaching event where here you can see any area that's alert 1 or alert 2 saw conditions that were hot enough to cause either coral bleaching or coral mortality. And so the map is showing the highest heat stress over that roughly 3-year period. And so you can see that most areas of the world saw some amount of heat stress, mostly enough to cause coral bleaching.
Alexa, house fan off.
Yeah, so this hasn't wiped out all corals. There's still corals out there. Plenty survived this bleaching event, but a huge number of reefs were impacted. It's estimated that anywhere from 30 to 50% of individual corals have been lost from this. So corals are able to regenerate, but it is important to note that climate change has many sort of future impacts, but it also has current impacts. And the impacts on coral reefs are definitely current impacts. They're not there will be additional impacts in the future, but climate change is definitely already having an impact on coral reefs. But a lot of our research at Scripps is focused on quantifying what's currently going on with coral reefs across the globe. How are they doing? And importantly, how are they changing over time? And so one of the big projects that our lab and Stuart Sandin's lab at Scripps are jointly working on is called the 100 Island Challenge. And it's a pretty ambitious effort to visit 100 different islands around the world and multiple sites at each of those islands at multiple points in time. And basically by documenting reef condition at different points in time at such a big global scale, be able to say not how is this region doing or what is causing coral decline in Hawaii specifically or the Caribbean specifically, to try to disentangle it and draw big conclusions across the globe, and to create this really big data set so that we can catalog reef condition right now and basically archive that and be able to use that as a reference point as reefs continue to change in the future. So that's a big ongoing project. In addition to that, the Smith Lab has been working for a long time on the island of Palmyra, which is a U.S. Outlying territory, basically a 2-hour plane ride south of Hawaii in the middle of nowhere. Palmyra is uninhabited. It has been since around World War II, when it was a military base for the United States. But now it is home to pristine reefs and has virtually no human impacts locally. And that makes it a really great laboratory to study the impact of climate change on a coral reef in the absence of overfishing and coastal development and tourism and all those other factors that I was talking about earlier. So our lab has been doing long-term monitoring there to see how those reefs have been doing. And they've actually been doing quite well. I mean, climate change is still having an impact. There was 2 bleaching events over the course of when we've been visiting, and there's signs that there might be a 3rd this year. But the corals have been able to bounce back because there aren't other local stressors that are causing chronic degradation in addition to the impact of climate change. So we'll continue monitoring there, but it's so far looking relatively optimistic. My research, instead of focusing on Palmyra, focuses on Maui and its coral reefs and coral reefs on the surrounding islands. So this is a map of the sites that we have in what we call the Maui Nui region of Hawaii. And so we've been monitoring for almost a decade now on Maui, and since 2017 on those neighboring islands. And it's been a really interesting project to work with local partners on a region that has, I guess, a bit more conservation relevance than Palmyra, because there are these complicated human impacts that are potentially confounding the climate signal, and lots of opportunities to work with local communities and to design conservation interventions. But I want to talk for a second about how we actually do the monitoring. Basically, when we go out to a reef, we take cameras with us and we swim back and forth over the reef, not as fast as this is sped up video, but we swim back and forth and take pictures that overlap with each other. And here you can see circled in red the same feature that's captured from multiple angles in different images. And because we have that overlap, we can use an algorithm when we get back to stitch those pictures together into a 3D model. And we can either study the reef directly from that 3D model, or we can create other products like a depth map or one large 2D, essentially picture map of the site. And we refer to all of this technology as large area imagery. But it's been really innovative for looking at change over time. So this is just a zoomed in portion of one of our long-term sites in Maui. And you can see over the course of time, examples of coral growth, coral bleaching, and coral death. And importantly, different fates of different corals that are right next to each other, facing the exact same environmental conditions. So it leads to some really interesting research questions of what are driving these outcomes on coral reefs, especially in cases where they're facing the same environmental conditions, and we're wondering why we might be seeing different outcomes for different corals. And so this is actually an example from Palmyra rather than Maui, but it's one 3D model that covers roughly a 10 by 10 meter area. And here, in this animation, some researcher has gone through and highlighted hundreds of different coral colonies and color-coded them by species. And so this type of research to answer, I think in this particular case, it was a population study to see for different species of corals, are there lots of older individuals or younger individuals? What is their spatial distribution around the reef? And so we can ask these really in-depth ecological questions using this model. And this model sort of highlights how much time it took someone to go through and do all this effort. And that takes a long time on the computer, but it would take even longer in the water on scuba, and really wouldn't be feasible because Palmyra or Maui, these are remote locations where we have limited field time. And so being able to have a model that we can take back with us allows us to ask these new in-depth questions that we wouldn't have been able to ask previously. We can also, as I was showing with that bleaching time series, we can layer models on top of each other. Here, the different colors are representing change from one year to another, with blue being increase in area and red being loss. So here, the blue halos around those gray table coral colonies are basically showing the amount of growth over a 1 year period, which is pretty substantial. And then the red are coral colonies that either got lost or rolled over or removed by some wave event or something like that. So a lot of change over the course of just 1 year here. Here's another example from Maui. We actually just visited this site back in July, and you can see this again, the same colors, with red being loss of structure and blue being a gain in structure. We actually saw quite a bit of damage from, we assume, a storm event that happened sometime between 2021 and 2023. Here you can see this one big coral colony was completely removed, and that's a colony about 3 feet across. It just became like a crater in the reef. And when we talked to some of the folks that we work with on Maui, they were saying that there was a historic south swell event that came through the area in 2022. And this site is in about 10 feet of water, and they're saying that there is about 10 to 15 foot waves that were crashing directly onto this site. So it sort of puts into context why you saw such big focus changes in some places where big chunks of the reef were missing. This is definitely a larger amount of change than we're used to seeing over just a 1 or 2 year period. But it just highlights the fact that these are dynamic ecosystems that do change over time, and being able to document that change is really important for communicating coral reef conservation urgency to folks, but also for studying sort of what are the normal bounds of change and when do we see things exceed those bounds of change. I want to talk a little bit more about bleaching. I mentioned the science behind that before, and just one of my research chapters for my PhD is focused on documenting the impact of bleaching on Maui. So there was a bleaching event in 2015 on Maui, and also in 2019, that had similar amounts of heat stress. So we would expect to see similar patterns of coral bleaching. And so this video on the left is actually showing some of those colonies bleaching in 2019. And this video here is from one of our sites in Maui, and basically moving left to right, you're moving forward in time. You could pick a colony on the left frame, and if you follow it through to the right, you can watch as it either bleaches or doesn't bleach, and then if it survives or doesn't survive. And this basically sums up the approach I was using in this research project. I would find individual coral colonies in our 3D models, And because the models are overlapping each other, could watch each colony year after year, see if it bleached or didn't bleach, if it grew or didn't grow, if it survived or didn't survive. And so for that, was interested in comparing between different sites around Maui to see if there are some places where coral populations are doing better than others. And so here, basically the colors are showing the bleaching pattern that those individual corals were showing over the course of 2014 to 2021. So you have some places like this one site called Kahekili, where this particular species of coral had much less bleaching than some of the other sites around the island. And so part of the reason why these sorts of results are important is they're currently considering doing coral restoration around Maui to find particular locations that are culturally significant and important for conservation, to go out and put fragments of corals out there so that those corals can grow and help the reef recover. And so knowing where to source those fragments from is super important. And so here we can see that maybe if we were to take fragments of corals from this reef in particular, we could outplant those onto the reef, and they might be less at risk from bleaching in the future, because you don't want to do restoration and then have those corals that you worked so hard to outplant and have grow also be impacted by a marine heat wave. So this sort of population level study can teach us things both about coral ecology, but also help to inform restoration efforts around Hawaii, in Maui in particular. And then just jumping back to Palmyra for a second, I mentioned that in the absence of local human impacts, reefs really have a remarkable recovery capacity. The Smith Lab also did a restoration experiment in Palmyra that they started in 2015 with these. It's hard to see. This is a 3 by 3 meter plot, and there's these little fragments of coral here and here. And then over the course of just a few years, we really saw some remarkable growth of these branching corals to cover a good chunk of that site. And I don't have imagery from the most recent years included in here, but I can assure you that the corals have just continued their growth trajectory and have really transformed that part of the reef. So just to show that when conditions are right, if we can really get a handle on some of the climate stuff, we can give reefs a fighting chance. And just with that, I want to return back to the slide that I had shown before, but this time sort of group these threats that corals are facing into two distinct categories. We have the threats in the yellow box, marine heat waves, ocean acidification, sea level rise, and tropical storms that are all related to climate change. And as you all know, to address climate change, we really need to work as a global community together to lower emissions so that we can actually see reductions in marine heat waves and all these other impacts. Now, for small conservation organizations on Maui, for example, if they're focused on improving the health of their reefs specifically, there's not much they can do within their purview to address climate-related threats to reefs. They're relying on everyone around the world to work together to address climate change. But what they can do is try to address these threats that are in the purple box. For example, they can have fisheries regulations. They can restrict tourism to certain locations or the number of tourists. They can restrict coastal development near really sensitive reef areas. And so these are just sort of ways of thinking about local impacts and how conservation on a local scale really interfaces with these threats and uses specific policy levers to try to reduce threats that corals are facing so that they are better positioned to survive those effects of climate change. Thinking back to that Palmyra restoration example, if we can basically eliminate or reduce the local threats that corals are facing, corals have demonstrated capacity to be better able to cope with climate change. So really our focus on a local conservation standpoint should be to reduce these other threats, and then also encourage global action on climate change as sort of a companion to that. Because if we don't eventually get climate change under control, no amount of local reducing tourism or fishing and stuff like that is going to save reefs. We do eventually need global climate action. to help reefs. But I'm going to go through this last part kind of quickly because I want to make sure we have time for questions. But one of the other projects I'm doing in Maui is working with the Nature Conservancy and the Division of Aquatic Resources, which is the state management agency in Maui, to basically use our monitoring data from these 3D models to try to identify which reefs might be the most resilient to climate change in the future, and to try to prioritize areas of the reef for conservation. So again, using our data to inform decision making. And so basically the way that works is you go out on the reef, measure a bunch of different environmental parameters, and then rank those sites basically say this one's going to be the most resilient, and it will, we think based on this data that it's going to do the best in the future in terms of having high coral cover, lots of fish, persisting and providing ecosystem services for people. And then we can recommend that we prioritize those resilient reefs for protection as the climate changes. One of the challenges is the Nature Conservancy already did this in 2018, but they only had 1 year of data to work off of. And so we wanted to use our time series going back all the way to 2014. And these arrows are just showing some of the places where our monitoring sites overlap with their sites. And so basically the idea is basically if we have similar results to what their approach showed, then the consistency in the methods that we're using show that this is a useful conservation planning tool. Because if we were to go out and do the same methods with our 3D models as they did in the water, but get very different results, like this site is important, but we're finding this site is important, then that means that the method is pretty sensitive to the inputs being given to it, which means that the results might not be that robust in terms of making decisions off of those. Similarly, if we recreate their resilience assessment at multiple different years of our time series, if we get the same results, that's encouraging that resilience is stable over time and that we're consistently getting this signal that we should prioritize a given location. Versus if every year we do it, we get a different signal of this reef's important. No, wait, this reef's important, this one. If that were the case, this would be a less useful approach. So basically this whole project was trying to identify if a conservation tool, a planning tool, was actually doing what it was supposed to or not, and using our monitoring data to basically do this exercise. And so just some preliminary results. Each of these little graphs is for one of our sites, and they're color-coded in the circle based on the Nature Conservancy's resilience assessment back in 2018. So it was finding that like this site offshore was the most resilient, followed by this site and then this site and so on. And then the little graphs for each site is showing the results of our assessment using our 3D model time series, and then how the resilience of sites changes over time, with 1 being that site is relatively the most resilient, and then 0 being less resilient. So you can see we did have some consistency over time, like this Molokini site was consistently showing up as being one of the most resilient, both according to our methods, but also the Nature Conservancy's methods. This site, Wahakuli, was consistently low resilience, both our methods and the Nature Conservancy. So that's good that there's agreement between these different resilience assessments. But we also were seeing, when we looked at how these sites were changing over the course of 10 years, that actual observed change wasn't necessarily matching up with the predictions of resilience. For example, basically each of these bars is a different sampling year, and the colors are the different species of corals. So for this site here, you can see that coral cover stayed pretty stable and even increased overall over the monitoring period, even though this site was projected to be one of the middle to lower resilient sites. And you can compare that with this site down here, Keavakapu, where coral cover has consistently decreased over time. We've actually seen a loss of almost half of the coral cover that it started with. So it went from about 50% coral cover to 20-something% coral cover. So that's a sign of some environmental factor or something is causing degradation here. So that site is showing less resilience than we would have thought based on the environmental conditions there. So I guess long story short, there's still a lot of uncertainty about what is driving this change, but it's important that we loop in our understanding, our evolving understanding of coral reef ecology into this conservation decision making so that we can make informed decisions about what reefs to protect, where to target for restoration, and how to move forward to protect coral reefs from climate change. Now, one final thing I do want to address, we do research in Maui, and recently there's been a terrible tragedy in Maui with the fires. We felt it particularly acutely because whenever we've gone and worked in Maui, we've stayed in Lahaina, and we have friends that live in Lahaina, that the boat operators who have taken us out year after year who have lost their homes and their boats and things like that. And just, it was a tragedy, but it also just reinforces, I've spent this whole talk talking about ecosystems and how they are being impacted by climate change. And all of my PhD has been focused on thinking about coral reefs sort of in a little bit of a silo, thinking about underwater, the corals and the fish, and how they are being impacted by warming temperatures. And then you have an event like this and it just wakes you up and it's like, well, it's not just the reefs, it's literally everyone and everything is being impacted by climate change. We've got the community of folks that live right next to these coral reefs that would be really devastated if the reef disappeared. But even if we save the reef, they're devastated if a fire comes through and wipes out their entire community. So it's just an extra sort of wake-up call of we need to do what we can to act on climate change as soon as possible, not just for the marine ecosystems, but for the people that live next to them. And I just want to share some pictures of us doing our research and with some of our local partners, because the fire pictures make me very sad. And it's just thinking about the people that we work with makes me feel better. Thankfully, no one we know or work with lost their lives with it. We did have some people lose property, but it's part of the tragedy is just that they're such a wonderful group of people. I can't think of a group of people less deserving to have something so terrible happen to them. And just, again, reinforces that for the good of everyone, we need to be working to address climate change to reduce these sorts of negative impacts. But yeah, I've just throughout the talk talked about various ways that our lab has been conducting research that relates to active solutions or conservation focused interventions that can help either quantify how ecosystems are changing in response to climate change, or even propose ways to slow down that change or help ecosystems adapt. We're using new technology in the process, which has been really cool to both to see how ecosystems are changing, but to be able to fold in conservation into technology. And all hope is not lost for the ocean. I think the ocean, coral reefs, kelp forest, the intertidal, these are incredibly resilient systems that I think if we are able to give them a break by reducing greenhouse gases and giving them more adaptive capacity, they will respond by being resilient and recovering. So all hope is not lost for the ocean. And I'm aware I went a little long, so I'm happy to stay as long as people are willing to be on the call to answer questions, depending on how many questions people have. So thank you guys for your time.
Well, we do have a few questions, and I'm wondering if we want to also unmute and allow people to ask questions just off the top of their heads.
Sure, that would work.
Okay. I had a few questions, so I'm just going to throw them out there. They're already there. I wanted to know whether the increase in coral predation that is due to the migration of starfish is due to water temperature changes in the starfish normal area.
That's a great question. There's been some conflicting research about what exactly drives the starfish outbreaks. There's been quite a bit of research out of Australia that's connected it to nutrients, like either from agriculture or other runoff. And that some of it is just thought to be by chance because these are organisms that produce a lot of eggs. And so if the conditions are right and the currents bring all those eggs back to the reef all at once, then you get an outbreak of a lot of individuals, whereas normally only a few eggs make it back. And then the other really big factor is there's this snail called a Triton's trumpet that is the main predator of the starfish, but it has been, in most parts of the world where they exist, has been overfished because it's a really big, pretty shell. So I think that and those three factors are commonly pointed to explain the outbreaks of these starfish. But I think there have been some studies that have looked into the role of temperature. I don't know the exact conclusions of those, but it definitely is still an active area of research to really get a handle on those dynamics and what is driving that.
It occurred to me, I don't understand also how overfishing impacts coral reefs. What's the connection?
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't go into that in detail. Corals, it's always tricky because I mentioned algae at first in a very positive light with the symbiotic algae that live in the corals. But there's also species of algae that are not living inside of corals that are competing with corals for space on the reef, because space is at a premium, just like corals are like the city of the ocean with lots of different things living there. It's just like if you're in New York City and there's every studio apartment costs like $10,000 or something a month. It's basically the same on a coral reef where everyone's fighting with each other to just get a foothold. And if you have very few herbivorous fish on the reef that eat algae, that algae gets an upper hand and can easily overgrow the corals. And so the fish help to sort of keep everything in balance and give the corals a better foothold and able to maintain their presence on the reef. So it's really the herbivorous fish that are important, but of course, for a healthy ecosystem, it helps to have all the different components there to keep everything in balance.
That's interesting. Mark Mervis just says, great presentation. He doesn't have a question right now. I have a question, what would the ripple effects out into the greater world be if the coral reefs actually were lost? What would happen?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, if you're losing an ecosystem that supports 1 in 4 ocean species, you're going to have ripple effects to other marine ecosystems because there's a lot of species that travel between coral reefs and other places. There's going to be impacts to fisheries, as I was mentioning, from sort of that 1 billion people that rely on coral reefs either for food or for their jobs or because the coral reefs protect their coastline. I know a lot of like islands in the Pacific, island nations, are already facing severe challenges with sea level rise and having to potentially relocate. But I can guarantee you those challenges would be even worse if they didn't have coral reefs surrounding their atolls or islands, because those coral reefs are actively preventing erosion of the atoll into the sea. I mean, the coral reefs are honestly the only reason those atolls even exist. So yeah, it would vary for different people. Like I don't know if a farmer in the middle of Nebraska would feel the loss of reefs as acutely as someone in Maui or someone living in Kiribati or somewhere in the middle of the Pacific, but it definitely is a large chunk of the human population that lives close to a tropical shoreline with coral reefs. And I think a lot of those people would be pretty heavily impacted if they disappeared.
Get that. Jonathan Cole asks, have you observed or do you anticipate any impacts on coral reefs from the Lahaina fires, such as ash effluent?
That is a great question. And that's actively being worked on by a number of folks. There was a group out of Australia that actually did a rapid response survey just a few weeks ago using similar technology to ours. And they haven't been able to crunch any numbers from it yet, but they didn't see any huge impacts close to Lahaina compared to elsewhere that they looked. So the thought is that it's still the dry season there, which is part of the reason the fire happened in the first place. But the one positive aspect of that is that a lot of the toxic ash and other things have not made their way into the water yet. And so the hope is that there's enough time for cleanup efforts to safely remove the ash and other toxins from land before the rainy season gives it a chance to wash onto the reef. But it's definitely a real concern because, I mean, this fire was hot enough to melt cars and like melt people's homes, and there's all sorts of toxins that were essentially burned and now turned to ash that have the potential to go onto the reef. And that could be very bad, not only for the corals and fish, but also for the local human population that goes surfing and swimming and eats fish caught on the reef. So I guess the good news is it doesn't seem to be any major impacts, at least visible impacts yet. I know they're still doing like water quality testing and stuff like that, and I don't think those results are back yet. But hopefully the remediation work can progress quickly enough before the rains come.
Wow. So do we have any questions?
I see Jim raising his hand, Jim Lau.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you, Jim.
All right. My brother and his wife were here about a month ago here in Fallbrook, but he lives in the Philippines, and they have a small resort on an island off the east, a large island off the east coast of Luzon, which is where Manila is. And they have it on a beautiful bay. And up till about 15 years ago, they had a really nice reef right off their beach line. And his last letter to me said that that reef is now all gray with that scuzzy stuff that you were talking about. And they have to take their guests an hour or more out to a island, a boat ride out to an island in order for them to be able to go scuba diving at all and really see anything. And also the town that is near them has been growing, and they've done overfishing because of the population. And I'm not sure what their sanitation has been with their increased population and runoff and stuff like that. But what I'm asking you is, since this reef has obviously died, it's off his beach line there, is there any hope for that reef in the future, or is it going to have to wait 50 or 100 or 1,000 years for something to happen again there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I guess the thing I mentioned that reefs have recovery capacity, and I talked about it a little bit with that example from Palmyra, showing the growth of those restored corals. And then also that video, I'll go back to it, from the Maldives, where there was you could see the growth of corals over time. Here, one back.
I don't know if those reefs were completely dead or not, though. They were.
Yeah. I guess what I'm trying to say is that the recovery time frame for a coral reef, even starting from pretty degraded, is usually, I've seen various estimates in the literature, but it's usually about a decade. So if there were no disturbances, like no storms or bleaching events, and people, either if the natural recovery or if someone was able to go out and do a restoration program, after about a decade, you should start to see pretty good, healthy coral cover and stuff like that. Now, that's definitely not a sure thing because like a storm could come through, there could be a heat wave. And so oftentimes reefs are always sort of approaching that climax, but never actually reaching it, because even without climate change or people, there's all sorts of things that happen. Like even just in the short amount of time that I've been doing research on Maui, we've had 2 bleaching events, multiple either storms or near misses from storms, and then other things like COVID had all sorts of unforeseen impacts on these reefs, and then the fires in Lahaina. So it's like these places are just really dynamic. Even if we're not paying attention to it, they're always changing. And so being able to survive undisturbed for a while to reach that recovery potential is not always a given. But if those local impacts that are driving degradation are either removed or lessened, it gives the reef a better capacity to grow and reach that recovery potential So I guess the long and short of it is, if they had money to invest in restoration, I would encourage them to pursue it only if they are also able to address some of the other factors, like if there's a lot of I know in that part of the world there's something called blast fishing, where they actually, some of the fishermen use dynamite to basically, they throw it into the water.
They do use that there, yes.
Yeah, like for example, if they were still doing that actively in that coastline, then I wouldn't advise spending a bunch of money and effort on restoration until that practice is brought under control, because you're going to spend all this effort trying to get corals to grow, and then that effort's just going to go out the window the next time someone throws a stick of dynamite into the water.
Well,
So it's really,
all the big fish are gone, and the
yeah,
reef is dead, so you don't have the little ones being able to grow to big ones anymore. And the fishermen are all going further and further out
mhm.
to the other islands that are off the coast there to fish. And I don't see the population going down at all either.
Yeah.
So
No,
I don't know if there's really any hope in the near future.
it's definitely, a lot of these problems are bigger than any one resort or organization, and oftentimes require sustained either conservation or organization between different groups, which can make them really intractable, difficult, like essentially social problems. We try to tackle them from a scientific angle to understand what the ecology is and what's going on, but a lot of times the conservation challenges are more social problems, and dealing with social policy issues like sanitation, or human population that's increasing faster than the local resources can provide for it, which can lead to this sort of unsustainable fishing and people not having jobs and stuff like that. So it's really like any sort of development efforts to help the Philippines increase the quality of life for people and help to improve sanitation and things like that, I think will also help to benefit coral reefs,
Sure.
as long as it's not like giant coastal developments that are leading the coastline to get trashed or something like that.
Right, you've got to have the will of the government to do projects like sanitation facilities and things like that. But it's
Yeah.
got to have some political will. And in the Philippines, it's there's a lot of money under the table that gets moved around, and that's how things get done.
Yeah. Yeah, the whole coral conservation challenge, it's such a patchwork of small scale efforts and projects, sort of country scale priorities and development, and then the global scale activism around climate action, that all of them, that none of them can happen by themselves and have the ultimate impact. They all sort of need to be happening simultaneously, which is easier said than done, but it still is a necessity.
Let's hope that things will change.
It's- Well, it looks like we've kept you longer than we planned, Orion.
Okay.
Well, I appreciate you did that. I have 1,000 more questions, but I can't keep you all night. So I just want to thank you, and I learned a lot. I hope we all did tonight. And those of you who are here, be sure and tell your friends to watch this on the YouTube.
Thank you guys. And I guess, Cynthia, you have my email if there are any questions that come in, or any other things that you need to reach out about. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I do. Thank you. Thank you for offering that.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank
you all.
you. Thanks. That was great.
Good night, everyone.
Right.
Good night.
Night.